Hello there, and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Pull up something comfortable if you can, maybe a blanket, maybe a warm drink. Maybe you are already settled into bed with the lights low and the day finally beginning to loosen its grip on you. Wherever you are, I hope this hour can become a quiet place to rest for a while, even though the place we are travelling to tonight is anything but quiet. Because tonight, we're not going to a palace, or a candlelit drawing room, or a battlefield at the moment when the lines advance and the flags rise above the smoke. We are going somewhere that history often mentions only in passing, even though thousands of men remembered it more vividly than the battle itself. We're going to spend the night in an American Civil War field hospital. Not a hospital in the modern sense. Not brick walls, polished floors, white sheets, and neat rows of machines murmuring beside each bed. A Civil War field hospital could be a farmhouse emptied in haste, a barn that still smelled faintly of hay and animals, a church with pews pushed aside, or a spread of canvas tents thrown up near the rear of a battlefield because there was no time to find anything better. It was close enough to receive the wounded, but never far enough from the war to feel safe. The guns might have gone quiet by nightfall, or they might still mutter in the distance. The ground outside might be torn by wheels and boots. The roads might be clogged with ambulances, wagons, exhausted orderlies, and men who could still walk but not for much longer. And here is the thing I want you to keep in mind from the very beginning. A Civil War field hospital at night was not a place where the day ended. It was a place where the day refused to end. Battle might conclude at sunset. The wounded did not. Surgeons worked through darkness. Stewards moved between tables and stretchers. Nurses, volunteers and attendants carried water, bandages, blankets, broth, messages, and sometimes the final words of men too badly hurt to see mourning. In many battles, the real labour of survival began after the shooting slowed down. Before we step into that night, let me ask you something gently. What time is it where you are right now? Are you listening in a room that is already dark with only a screen or bedside lamp nearby? Are you on a couch at the end of a long day? Are you somewhere far from home, using a familiar voice to make a strange place feel softer? If you feel like sharing, tell me where you're listening from tonight. I always love seeing the quiet little map that forms in the comments. One person listening in London, another in Ohio, another in Warsaw, another awake far later than they meant to be. And if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you like history that slows down long enough to notice the people living inside it, it would mean a great deal if you subscribed and gave this video a like. You do not need to do it now. Do it when the story earns it. When a detail surprises you, or when you catch yourself realising that something ordinary in your life would have felt almost miraculous to someone in the past. Now, let us go back. It is late in the summer of 1862, or perhaps the autumn of 1863. The exact battle matters less than the condition of the place we're entering, because versions of this night happened again and again during the war in Virginia, Maryland, Tennessee, Mississippi, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and beyond. The pattern changed in its details, but not in its essentials. A battle has been fought nearby. Men have been hit by miniature balls, shell fragments, canister, sabres, falling horses, collapsing fences, and every blunt accident that comes when thousands of bodies move through smoke and confusion. Some wounds are obvious the moment you see them. Others hide beneath torn wool and blood-darkened coats until a surgeon cuts the fabric away. Some men were brought in quickly. Others lay for hours before stretcher-bearers reached them. After reforms led by Dr. Jonathan Letterman in the Union Army, organised ambulance systems became much more effective, but even then, in the worst battles, the numbers could overwhelm every available wagon, every horse, every orderly, and every surgeon. Imagine that you're approaching the hospital on foot from the road. The sun has gone down, but the darkness is not complete. Lanterns hang from hooks, poles, wagon sides, and low branches. Fires have been built where they can be kept controlled. Their light does not make the hospital bright. It only reveals pieces of it. A line of tents, pale and dull in the night. A barn door standing open. Shadows moving against canvas walls. Horses stamping and snorting near ambulances. Men lifting stretchers down from wagons with practised care, though not always with enough hands. Somewhere nearby, someone is shouting for water. Someone else is calling for a surgeon. Another voice repeats a name, perhaps hoping that saying it often enough will make the man who owns it answer. The smell reaches you before the full scene does. Smoke from fires, mud, sweat soaked into wool uniforms, horse sweat, damp leather, wet earth churned by wheels, and underneath it a heavier smell that no one living through the Civil War needed explained once they had known it. The smell of blood in large quantity. Not one wound, not one injured man. Many. Enough that the ground beside an operating station could be darkened by it. Enough that surgeons sometimes stood for hours in stiffened clothing, moving from one case to the next because stopping would mean leaving someone to wait. This is one of the first modern misunderstandings worth clearing away. Civil War surgeons were not ignorant men hacking blindly in tents because they did not know better. They were working within the medical knowledge of their own time, under conditions that would break most people very quickly. They did not understand germ theory in the modern sense. They did not know that unwashed hands and instruments could carry invisible infection from one patient to another. They did know, however, that speed mattered, that shattered limbs often became deadly if not removed, and that a man with a catastrophic wound needed a decision made quickly. The war forced them to make those decisions in astonishing numbers. Roughly 3 out of 4 surgical operations performed during the conflict were amputations, not because surgeons enjoyed them, and not because every wound demanded one, but because the terrible damage caused by slow, heavy rifle bullets and artillery could leave limbs too mangled to save. You may have heard the old image of soldiers biting bullets while surgeons sawed through bone. It is one of those Civil War stories that has survived because it is dramatic, simple, and easy to picture. It is also deeply misleading. Anesthesia was widely used. Chloroform and ether were common in Civil War surgery, and the overwhelming majority of operations were performed with anesthetics. Chloroform was especially valued because it acted quickly and was easier to transport in smaller amounts. That does not mean surgery was gentle. It was still frightening, dangerous, and crude by modern standards. But the patient was not usually fully conscious through the cutting, as popular myth so often suggests. Still, before a patient reached the operating table, there was waiting. And the waiting may be the hardest part to imagine honestly. Inside the hospital, men are arranged wherever there is room, on cots if cots are available, on blankets, on straw, on the floorboards of a requisitioned house, against walls, under trees outside when the indoor spaces are full. The least gravely wounded may sit upright, holding bandaged arms or pressing cloth against a leg. Others lie still because movement brings too much pain. Some speak constantly, perhaps from fear, perhaps from shock, perhaps because silence would allow them to think too clearly. Others are quiet in a way that worries the attendants more than shouting ever could. A field hospital had to sort men quickly. Those who could likely be saved with immediate treatment needed to be moved forward. Those whose wounds were serious but not immediately fatal had to wait. Those whose injuries were beyond the practical ability of the hospital to repair might receive comfort, water, opiates if available, and prayer. The modern word triage would come later in common usage, but the Civil War medical system increasingly worked according to that hard necessity. Surgeons could not treat every man first. They had to decide who could survive an operation, who needed it without delay, and who would have to lie in pain while others went ahead of him. Now, picture the first room we enter. Let us make it a farmhouse kitchen, because many wartime hospitals began in homes that never expected to become hospitals at all. The table has been cleared. Perhaps it was used for meals that morning by a family now sheltering elsewhere, or pressed into helping as best they can. By night it serves another purpose. Surgical instruments rest nearby. Bandages sit in piles when there has been time to prepare them. Basins hold water that will not stay clean for long. A lamp burns above or beside the table. Another may be carried closer when the surgeon needs a better view. Men move in and out. There is no privacy. No gentle hallway separating one patient's fear from another's. A soldier waiting for treatment may hear the surgeon's instructions from the next table. He may hear the sound of boots shifting on the floor. He may hear a saw begin its work after the chloroform takes hold. He may hear an assistant say, "Hold him steady," or "More light here," or "Bring the dressing." That sentence alone sounds unbearable to us. More light here. Such a simple request, but in that room it matters enormously. Night surgery meant relying on lanterns, candles, and whatever firelight could be arranged safely nearby. Light fell unevenly. Shadows moved across the body. A surgeon needed to see the wound clearly enough to work fast, and speed was not impatience, it was survival. The shorter the operation, the less time a man remained exposed to shock, blood loss, and the physical strain of the procedure. In a crowded field hospital after a major engagement, surgeons might operate for hour after hour, with scarcely any pause except to wash their hands if they did so at all, wipe instruments, drink something, or move to the next case. Do not imagine that every person inside this place is a doctor. Far from it. Hospital stewards were essential figures in Civil War medical care. They kept supplies, filled prescriptions, prepared medicines, applied dressings, assisted with minor procedures, and handled an astonishing variety of duties that made the surgeon's work possible. Official expectations for stewards included knowledge of pharmacy, bandaging, minor surgery, extraction of teeth, and even cooking. In a field hospital at night, a competent steward could be everywhere at once in the eyes of a wounded man, carrying the cup, locating the requested item, answering the surgeon, checking the next patient, preparing the next dose. And then there are the nurses and volunteers. The war created a larger space for women in organised medical relief than had existed before in American military life, though their presence was still contested and often restricted. Some worked in general hospitals far from battle. Others, like Clara Barton, carried supplies directly to the field and helped care for the wounded close to active fighting. After major battles, women brought water, prepared food, dressed wounds, wrote letters, calmed frightened men, and performed the kind of steady human labour that keeps a hospital from becoming only a machine for procedures. Their work did not erase suffering. Nothing could. But it changed the experience of suffering. It meant that a soldier might not spend his worst night entirely alone. There is a small danger here in making the hospital sound orderly. It was not, at least not in the way we expect order now. Even the best-run field hospitals became overwhelmed when the casualty numbers rose. After Gettysburg, thousands of wounded were scattered across the region and eventually concentrated at Camp Letterman General Hospital. But in the immediate aftermath, local buildings, churches, barns, tents, and improvised stations had to absorb the first enormous shock. At Bentonville, wounded soldiers began arriving at a makeshift hospital within minutes of its establishment near the front. At Shiloh, one of the earliest large tent hospitals of the war was organised rapidly to receive hundreds. The pattern repeats. The hospital appears because the wounded are already coming. It grows under pressure, not in calm preparation. So when you imagine spending the night here, do not picture one fixed scene. Picture motion, constant motion. A stretcher arrives at the entrance. Someone asks where the man was hit. The answer is shouted back while he is still being carried. A surgeon glances once and decides whether he goes inside to another line or to the side where relief can be given while others are treated. A wagon rattles away and another replaces it. A wounded officer arrives with friends crowding near him until an orderly pushes them back. A private, with no one beside him, keeps asking whether his regiment is still on the field. A boy, far younger than his beard would suggest, has wrapped his own handkerchief around his arm so tightly that his fingers have gone pale. Someone cuts it loose. Someone tells him not to look. He looks anyway. Near the surgical area, the ground and floor tell their own story. Torn clothing accumulates, boots are pulled off swollen feet, coats are sliced open rather than unbuttoned. Blankets become soiled and are replaced when replacements exist. Bloodied bandages are carried away, instruments lie waiting, chloroform is poured carefully. The smell of it drifts briefly through the room, sharp and sweet, mingling with everything else. One man groans before losing consciousness. Another murmurs a prayer. Another tries to bargain, as men have always tried to bargain when they are frightened, promising anything at all if only the surgeon can save the leg. The surgeon may not answer immediately because he cannot afford to say what he does not yet know. Some men do not come in from the battlefield until long after dark. Before the ambulance system became better organised, wounded soldiers could remain unattended for many hours, even after improvements, darkness, terrain, enemy fire, destroyed roads, and the sheer number of casualties could delay removal. A field hospital at night therefore receives not just the wounded but the consequences of time, blood loss that has gone on too long, dirt ground into wounds, men shivering from shock and exposure, men too thirsty to speak clearly, men whose chances were better 2 hours earlier than they are now. This may be the point where you're tempted to imagine Civil War medical work as chaos without skill. It was not. It was skill working against impossible conditions. Surgeons made practical advances during the war in evacuation, hospital organisation, and the handling of mass casualties. The United States Army's medical structure changed under pressure, particularly through Letterman's reforms in transport and organisation. Those changes mattered. They saved lives. But none of that made a night in a field hospital easy. It only made survival more possible than it might otherwise have been. Now, let your attention move away from the operating table for a moment and settle on the men who are waiting. History tends to remember action, a charge, a volley, a surgeon's decision, an amputation completed in minutes. But much of a field hospital night is waiting. Waiting for your turn. Waiting for news of a brother who was brought in on another wagon. Waiting to know whether the wound is as bad as it feels. Waiting for the numbness of opium. Waiting for water. Waiting for dawn simply because dawn means you have lasted another stretch of hours. A soldier with a leg wound lies on a blanket near the doorway. Every time it opens, cold air comes in. He does not complain at first. There are men worse off. He can see that. But cold works slowly on patience. His jaw tightens. He watches every movement around him. Another man nearby has been shot through the shoulder and is lucid enough to talk. He asks where the nearest post office might be, because he wants a letter written home before anyone decides he is in no danger, and therefore can wait. Across the room, a wounded man calls for his mother. He may be 22. He may be 35. In the room, it does not matter. Pain has stripped away the uniform of adulthood and left a voice from childhood behind. And the workers hear all of it. The surgeon hears it. The steward hears it. The nurse hears it. The chaplain, if one is present, hears it. They cannot answer every call immediately. That may be one of the most painful truths about such places. Compassion was real, but time was limited. A person could care deeply and still walk past someone who was begging for attention because another patient would die without immediate help. Field hospitals were built on decisions no one wanted to make, and everyone inside them had to live with. Outside, the night continues. The battlefield itself is not fully asleep. There may be pickets posted in the distance. Officers may still be gathering reports. Men who escaped injury search for missing friends when they can, though often they are ordered back into line or told to wait. Burial details may begin their work by dawn, but before that, the wounded dominate the night. They are the unfinished business of the battle. If rain begins, the hospital changes again. Canvas drums softly under it. Paths become slick. Wagons bog down. Fires need tending. Blankets grow damp. If the hospital is in a barn or house, the interior becomes more crowded because no one wants to leave patients outdoors. If it is hot, the air thickens. If it is cold, men near the doorway suffer. There is no climate control, no sealed quiet, no clean separation between weather and medicine. The night outside presses directly against the work inside. And still, this place is not without tenderness. A cup held carefully to cracked lips, a blanket folded beneath a man's head, a hand resting for a moment on a shoulder before moving on, a nurse helping a soldier dictate a letter, a steward finding a little broth, a comrade who refuses to leave the doorway until someone tells him whether his friend is alive. The field hospital is terrible, but it is also full of people trying to reduce terror by inches. That matters. It mattered then. It matters when we remember it now. There is another detail worth understanding before we step further in. The hospital did not belong to one side in every practical sense once the wounded were in front of the surgeon. Both Union and Confederate medical personnel treated enemy wounded in many circumstances, especially where hospitals changed hands or where one army held the field after battle. At Wilson's Creek, both Union and Confederate wounded were treated at the same makeshift hospital. Civil War medicine was part of war, but at its best it also revealed moments when suffering became more immediate than allegiance. That does not mean prejudice vanished. It did not. That does not mean care was equal in every place or every circumstance. It was not. But within the limited, brutal space of the field hospital, there are recorded moments when a wounded man's uniform mattered less than the fact that he was bleeding and within reach. That truth belongs beside the darker ones. By now, the night is fully settled. The hospital has been receiving wounded for hours, and it will not stop soon. The first wave came with urgency. The next waves come with exhaustion. The men being carried in are quieter now, not because the wounds are less severe, but because fatigue has spread over the whole place. The stretcher bearers are tired, the wagon drivers are tired, the surgeons are tired, the attendants are tired. Even the men who are waiting are tired of fear, tired of noise, tired of asking questions no one can answer yet. A lantern flickers near the entrance. Someone shields it with a hand and trims the wick. Beyond that small circle of light, wheels grind over the road again. Another ambulance, another arrival. Before the men inside have processed the last case, the next one is already at the door. And that is where we need to stand for a while, just outside the threshold, listening as the wagon stops, as boots hit the ground, as a stretcher is drawn carefully out into the night air. Because the hospital does not truly reveal itself when you glance at the tents from a distance. It reveals itself when the wounded begin to arrive in numbers, when one body becomes 10, 10 become 50, and every person inside must decide what can be done first, what must be done quickly, and what cannot be fixed at all. The first wagon does not arrive gracefully. It comes out of the dark at a hard, uneven pace, wheels striking ruts in the road, leather traces pulling tight, horses blowing through their nostrils as if they too understand that stopping is not yet allowed. Someone walks beside the lead team with a lantern held low, not because the road is unfamiliar, but because the ground has been ruined by the day. Artillery wheels cut deep grooves into it. Infantry boots pressed it down and tore it apart. Rain, if there has been rain, has turned the road into heavy mud. If there has not, dust rises in dull clouds and settles on sweat, blood and canvas alike. The wagon slows only when it reaches the edge of the hospital ground. Men step forward before it has fully stopped. They do not need to ask what it carries. The shape of the bodies inside tells them. One soldier lies on his side with both hands clenched near his stomach. Another has his head propped against a rolled coat, his face so pale in the lantern light that he seems to glow. A third grips the wooden sideboard whenever the wheels jolt, then releases it as if even that small effort has cost too much. Beneath them are blankets, straw, coats, anything that could soften the ride, though nothing truly softens a road in wartime when every bump travels straight through a shattered bone. The men waiting to unload the wagon work quickly. 2 climb up, 2 stand below. The stretcher is raised, angled, pushed inward beneath the first wounded man, as carefully as circumstances allow. Someone says, "Easy now." Someone else says, "Mind the leg." The man cries out anyway, not because anyone has been careless, but because there is no way to move him without pain. The stretcher lowers, boots scrape in the dirt. The hospital takes one more body into itself, and before the men carrying him have disappeared through the doorway or tent flap, another wagon is already being heard on the road behind him. This is the rhythm of the evening now. Wheels, horses, lanterns, stretchers. Wheels, horses, lanterns, stretchers. The firing may have slowed on the battlefield, or perhaps it continues in scattered bursts farther away, but the hospital is no longer waiting for the battle to explain itself. It knows what has happened by what keeps arriving. Early in the war, this process had been far less organised. Men wounded in battle were often left where they fell far longer than anyone wished to admit. At First Bull Run in July of 1861, the Union Army's arrangements for removing the wounded collapsed badly, and many injured soldiers were forced to make their own way back toward Washington, or remain on the field without timely aid. The problem was not simply a shortage of wagons. It was the lack of a clear system. Who controlled the ambulances? Who was responsible for retrieving the wounded? Who decided where they went? Who made sure the vehicles did not disappear for unrelated duties in the chaos of a campaign? In the opening year of the war, the answers were too often uncertain, and uncertainty cost lives. By the summer of 1862, the Union Army of the Potomac began to change that under the direction of Dr. Jonathan Letterman. He pushed for a dedicated ambulance corps, not a loose collection of borrowed wagons and whoever happened to be available, but an organised branch of battlefield medicine with its own personnel, vehicles and responsibilities. Under the system ordered in August of that year, regiments received designated ambulances, each light ambulance crewed by a driver and 2 litter bearers, meant to move wounded men from the field toward aid stations and hospitals. Larger movements followed, with the injured carried from the immediate danger zone to regimental or divisional care, and then farther back as needed. It sounds orderly when described this way. On paper, it is orderly. On a night after battle, order still comes wrapped in groans, shouting and exhaustion. Imagine standing near the hospital entrance as the wagons come in one after another. You would begin to recognise different sounds. The sharp, hollow rattle of an ambulance with lighter wheels. The heavier rumble of a supply wagon pressed into emergency use because there are never enough proper vehicles when casualties rise. The snorting impatience of horses held too long. The clink of metal buckles. The rough call of a driver asking where to turn. The answer, shouted back, might be to the barn, to the tent line, to the church, to the rear yard, depending on which area still has room. No one says, "Bring them all here." There is no single here large enough. The men who bring the wounded do not arrive untouched by what they have seen. Ambulance drivers and stretcher bearers work dangerously close to active battle. Their task required them to move toward places everyone else had been trained to move away from. They crossed ground still vulnerable to rifle fire and artillery. They searched among fallen men while smoke drifted low and visibility failed. They lifted soldiers whose wounds were obvious, and others who seemed almost whole until they tried to speak. They had to decide quickly whom to move first, how to position a broken body on a stretcher, when to pause, when to risk going back for one more man before the light failed. Later in the war, reports would record medical personnel and ambulance corps members killed and wounded in significant numbers, evidence of how exposed this work could be. One stretcher party appears out of the dark before the next wagon reaches the entrance. They're carrying a man without waiting, for transport because the distance is short enough, or because no wagon could reach him where he lay. His coat is open. His shirt has been cut. The bandage around his chest is already darkening. The bearers move in uneven coordination, one taller than the other, and every correction they make transfers a small shift through the stretcher frame. The wounded man keeps his teeth clenched until they are nearly at the entrance. then lets out a low sound, not quite a cry, not quite a word. A hospital attendant turns toward them immediately. The stretcher does not even touch the ground before a decision is made about where to take him next. In the background, another driver is arguing because his wagon has men who have been waiting too long. An attendant replies that everyone has been waiting too long. Neither man is wrong. That is what makes the conversation hard. A soldier on the backboard, still conscious, asks whether he is at the hospital yet. No one answers directly. They are unfastening the tailgate. If you had watched this process before the war, you might not have understood how important the wagon itself was. But in the field hospital's world, transport is medicine. A surgeon cannot help a man who is still lying in a cornfield half a mile away. A nurse cannot bring water to someone whose location no one knows. A splint cannot be applied to a limb if the patient never reaches the station where tools and hands are waiting. The ambulance system did not cure wounds. It changed the amount of time between injury and care, and that difference could mean everything. At Antietam in September of 1862, the newly organised system was tested on a massive scale, and accounts credit it with removing Union wounded from the battlefield far more efficiently than in earlier campaigns. Letterman's evacuation principles became one of the most important medical developments of the war. Still, not every army, every theatre or every moment of the war worked equally well. Confederate medical services developed their own systems and often showed considerable ingenuity under severe shortages, but the Confederacy faced persistent limitations in vehicles, horses, equipment and supply. Even within better organised Union formations, terrain and combat could wreck the best plan. A road blocked by artillery, a bridge destroyed, a mass of retreating soldiers, a sudden renewal of gunfire, a shortage of horses, a rainstorm that turned earth into suctioning clay. Any of these could delay evacuation. The field hospital might hear the wounded before it saw them, voices approaching long before lantern light revealed the moving line. The most badly injured men sometimes arrived almost silent. They had cried out earlier, they had asked for water earlier, they had called to comrades earlier. By the time the wagon reached the hospital, shock had pulled them inward. Their skin might be cool, their eyes might wander without settling, their hands might move weakly against the stretcher blanket as if searching for something. A surgeon or assistant would lean close and speak loudly enough to be heard. "Where are you hit? Can you move your fingers? What regiment?" The answer might come. It might not. Behind them, another man is very loud, cursing his wound, cursing the road, cursing the whole war in a voice strong enough to reassure the attendants that, for the moment, he still has strength left. There is a temptation to treat screaming as the central sound of such a night, because it is the sound easiest for imagination to seize. But the wagons arrive before the screaming stops, and they continue arriving after some men no longer have breath to scream at all. The hospital's noise is layered. There are cries of pain, yes, but there is also instruction, repetition, bargaining, coughing, prayer, wagon wheels, chains, the whickering of nervous horses, the scrape of stretchers over thresholds, buckets set down too hard, blankets shaken open, doors opening and closing, rain on canvas if rain comes, and voices constantly asking for names. Names matter because someone is trying to keep track. Names matter because a regiment will ask. Names matter because a family may one day need to know where a man was taken, and whether he lived long enough to speak. A clerk or hospital steward may stand beside a table with a ledger, recording what can be recorded in a night that resists neat accounting. Name, rank, regiment, nature of wound, if known, arrival, if there is time to note it. Sometimes the man gives the information himself, sometimes a comrade speaks for him, sometimes a tag, a paper or a mark on his clothing provides the clue. Sometimes no one knows, and the man enters the hospital as an unknown soldier long before that phrase becomes ceremonial. Another wagon arrives carrying men from different regiments together because there was no reason to waste space. One is Union. Another may be Confederate if the area has shifted hands or if they have been gathered from the same ground after the fighting. Civil War hospitals did sometimes treat enemy wounded, though not always equally or immediately, and scarcity often shaped the order of care. Yet once wounded men were side by side in a wagon, their suffering had already forced a kind of proximity battle never intended. The same jolting road, the same stale air beneath the canvas cover, the same hope that the team would keep moving. The loading itself was difficult. A man with a shattered leg could not simply be lifted by shoulders and knees like a healthy body carried after a fall. His wound had to be supported. A soldier with abdominal injury might dread every incline of the road. A man shot through the arm could still sit upright, but if the wagon lurched, he might collapse against someone with worse wounds. Ambulances offered improvement over crude carts, and specialised designs such as the four-wheeled Rosecrans ambulance reflected attempts to carry patients more safely. But no horse-drawn vehicle made a battlefield road gentle. The ambulance was a mercy. It was not comfort. You can see this as the wagon doors open. Straw has shifted. One blanket lies bunched beneath a soldier's shoulder. Another man's boot has worked loose. A third has gripped the side rail so long that his fingers do not unclench immediately when an orderly touches them. The driver looks back once, not lingering, just checking. Then he turns toward the horse team because he knows he may be sent out again before the hour is over. That is another thing to understand. The wagons are not arriving at the end of their task. They are completing one loop in a task that continues. Drivers unload and return. Bearers set down one stretcher and reach for another. The hospital absorbs the injured while the evacuation system turns back toward the field. The night becomes a circuit between battle and care, danger and relative safety, open ground and crowded rooms. At a major engagement, this could continue on a scale that strains belief. After Gettysburg, Union Medical Director Letterman reported that 14,193 Union wounded were removed from the field within the Army's lines, and by early morning on July 4th, he stated that none of those wounded remained there unattended. That claim reflected the effectiveness he saw in the ambulance corps under extreme conditions, even after 3 days of massive fighting. It does not mean the experience was smooth. It means the machinery of evacuation functioned with remarkable determination, despite the scale of suffering. Now imagine the hospital after hours of this. The receiving area is no longer only crowded. It has developed its own geography. Near one wall, men with arm wounds wait to be examined. Closer to the operating space are those whose injuries may require immediate surgical judgment. Outside, men not yet admitted lie beneath blankets where attendants can still reach them. A pile of muskets, cartridge boxes, belts, and haversacks has formed because the wounded cannot keep carrying the objects that define them in battle. Uniform coats are folded, tossed, or cut away. Boots rest in pairs and single strays. Some items will find their owners again, some will not. A wagon approaches with one man calling out continuously for his brother. He does not know whether his brother is with him. He only knows they were near each other when the line broke apart. Every few breaths he asks, "Thomas, Tom, are you there?" No one in the wagon answers. At the hospital, as they lower him, he asks the same question again. An attendant tells him they will look. It may be true. It may be a kindness offered because no better answer exists. Nearby, another soldier insists he can walk. He likely could have earlier. Now he swings one leg down from the wagon and nearly falls. Two men catch him. He protests out of pride, then stops because the effort has made him dizzy. This happens often enough that attendants know not to argue. They simply support the man until he understands what his body has already decided. There are moments when the field hospital receives not only men but information. A driver says the left side of the field is still thick with wounded. A stretcher bearer says a cluster remains near a stone wall. Someone else says the firing resumed near the road and they had to turn back once. These fragments shape decisions. More ambulances may be sent one way. A surgeon may realise the night will be longer than expected. A steward may begin counting supplies differently. Water, whiskey, chloroform, bandages, lint, blankets, lantern oil. Everything is finite. Each wagon forces a new calculation, and still another arrives. The hospital begins to know the road by sound. A slow wagon may mean badly wounded men whom the driver is trying not to jolt. A fast one may mean urgency, or panic, or both. If a horse stumbles, heads turn. If a wheel catches on stone, someone curses. If the wagon stops too far from the entrance, attendants wave it closer with impatient gestures, because every extra yard is another yard carried by human arms. I want you to sit with the people performing that carrying for a moment. The stretcher bearers are not abstract helpers passing through the background. They are exhausted men with aching shoulders, wet collars, muddy cuffs, and hands numbed by gripping wooden poles. They squat, lift, step, correct their balance, lower, turn back, and do it again. They may pass the same stretch of ground dozens of times in a single night. Some bearers become familiar with particular cries because they have heard them on the field, in the wagon, and now at the hospital door. Their work does not involve the dramatic precision of surgery, but without them, surgery does not happen. At times they bring in men who have already died during the ride. No one announces this with ceremony. The stretcher lowers. A hand checks quickly. The body is moved aside, not without respect, but with the ruthless practicality that a crowded hospital requires. Space near the entrance cannot remain blocked. The living are still arriving. One of the hardest features of wartime medical care is that grief has to wait its turn. The wagons keep coming deep into the night because the battlefield does not empty itself at sunset. In some campaigns, evacuation continued under darkness, guided by lanterns and memory. Letterman himself described large numbers of wounded being moved at night during operations in 1862, emphasizing the ability of organized ambulance services to transport them safely toward hospital care. It was difficult, dangerous labor, but by the middle years of the war, it had become increasingly central to how armies tried to preserve life after battle. If you're listening now from a quiet room, perhaps with the faint mechanical comfort of central heating, or a fan or a refrigerator humming from another room, the road outside that Civil War hospital may feel very far away. It should. That distance is mercy. Yet there is something worth noticing in the plainness of what the hospital demanded. Not speeches, not banners, not high ideals. Wheels that held, horses that kept pulling, men willing to go back into dangerous ground. Hands steady enough to lower a stretcher without dropping it, a lantern carried where it was needed, a driver remembering which path was still passable. Survival often depended on things so practical that they disappear from grand histories unless we choose to look directly at them. The battle creates the wounded. The wagons create the possibility that some of them will live. By midnight, perhaps earlier, perhaps later, the hospital entrance no longer feels like an entrance at all. It feels like a mouth through which the war keeps feeding itself into the rooms beyond. The attendants have lost track of how many wagons have come. The road remains active. The horses are steaming in the cooler air. Drivers wipe their mouths with sleeves and turn their teams around. Stretcher bearers adjust their grips. A surgeon glances up only once before looking back down to the case before him, because he knows what the sound of wheels means now. It means more have arrived, and inside, where lamps burn against the dark and the floor has become crowded with men waiting for decisions, the next work begins before the last work has had any chance to end. Inside the tent, the road becomes a dull sound behind canvas. The wheels still come, the horses still stamp and snort, men still call for help in the dark. But once you pass beneath the tent flap, or through the open doorway of a barn or farmhouse pressed into hospital service, the night changes its shape. Outside, everything arrives at once. Inside, everything narrows. A table, a lantern, a surgeon's hands. One wounded man placed down while another waits close enough to hear what happens next. Call it the surgeon's tent because that is the image that has survived in memory. Canvas glowing faintly from lamps within, shadows shifting across its walls as if the building itself were breathing. But during the Civil War, a field operating space could be almost anything large enough to hold a table and desperate enough to be used. A barn, a church, a schoolhouse, a family parlour, a farmhouse dining room cleared in a hurry. Sometimes the operating table was a proper hospital table brought in a medical wagon. Sometimes it was a door laid across two supports. Sometimes it was whatever flat surface could hold the weight of a man. The army worked with what the battle left available, and the battle rarely left anything ready. The light is the first thing you notice once you are inside. Not enough of it. Never enough. Lanterns hang where they can. Candles burn down in holders improvised from wood or metal. Their glow collects on the surgeon's instruments, catches on the curve of a basin, flashes along a blade, then vanishes again when someone steps between the flame and the table. In some field hospitals, operations were performed outdoors when daylight remained because the open air offered the best visibility. At night, the surgeon depended on whatever lamps could be found and kept lit. Surgeon W. W. Keane later recalled using a block of wood bored with holes to hold several candles as an operating light. Clara Barton, working near Antietam, brought lanterns from her supply wagon after darkness stopped surgeons from continuing their work and the operations resumed. Light in that room is not decoration. It is equipment. Without it, a surgeon can lose time, make mistakes, or be forced to pause while a wounded man waits. The man on the table has already travelled through several layers of the hospital system before reaching this point, even if he remembers none of it clearly. He may have been hit in the afternoon and carried first to an aid station near the fighting, where bleeding was checked, a rough bandage applied, perhaps whiskey given against shock and opium for pain. From there, he was moved by ambulance toward the field hospital, usually placed far enough from the line to escape most direct artillery danger, while still close enough to receive the wounded quickly. By the time he arrives before the surgeon, his face may be grey from blood loss, his uniform has been cut open around the injury, his boots may be muddy, his lips are dry. He has heard enough along the way to know that being brought to this table means a decision is coming. The surgeon bends over him with an assistant close at hand. Another assistant may already be preparing the anaesthetic. In the organised field hospitals developed under Jonathan Letterman's reforms, the operating staff could include selected surgeons assigned specifically to major operations, with assistants under their direction, and one aide recommended to administer anaesthesia. Letterman wanted the most skilled available men doing the most serious surgical work, not random officers making life-changing decisions in isolation amid confusion. He also emphasised record-keeping, supplies, shelter, food, and a more deliberate hospital structure, because by the middle of the war it had become impossible to pretend that battlefield medicine could function well through improvisation alone. That structure matters, but it does not make the scene calm. It makes it possible. The surgeon still has too many patients. The assistants still move quickly. Men waiting nearby still understand that the room can only hold one operation at a time. A wounded soldier watches the surgeon examine his leg and tries to read his face. He may ask whether it can be saved. He may not ask because he is afraid to hear the answer. The surgeon studies the damage, not with modern X-rays, not with sterile imaging, but through sight, touch, experience, and the grim knowledge of what Civil War bullets did to bone. A mini-A ball striking an arm or leg could splinter bone extensively. Artillery fragments could tear tissue and joints beyond repair. When the damage was severe enough, amputation was often judged the best chance of survival. It was not done because surgeons were careless. It was done because infection, gangrene, and uncontrolled blood loss were deadly threats, and medical options for reconstructing shattered limbs were very limited. Here is one of the details popular memory has handled badly. The Civil War operating table was not usually a place where a fully conscious man simply clenched his teeth around a bullet while a surgeon began cutting. Chloroform and ether were available, and anaesthesia was widely used during the war. Surgeons understood its value and employed it in the overwhelming majority of major operations. That does not make the moment before surgery easy. The patient may still be terrified. He may resist the mask or cloth when it is brought near. He may ask once more whether there is another way, but the intention is to render him unconscious before the operation begins, and in many thousands of cases that is exactly what happened. An assistant leans close. The anaesthetic is administered. The soldier's breathing changes. The tension in his shoulders loosens little by little. His hand, which had been gripping the edge of the table or the sleeve of someone standing beside him, relaxes. The surgeon waits only as long as necessary. Every minute matters. There are other men outside. There are more wagons on the road. There are surgeons who will work until exhaustion makes their bodies feel borrowed. Once the patient is insensible, the table becomes a place of practice sequence. A tourniquet may be applied above the injury, or an assistant may use pressure to control blood flow. The surgeon begins with the skin, then muscle, exposing the damaged structures beneath. If a limb must be removed, the bone is cut with a surgical saw. Major blood vessels are tied off with silk ligatures. Bone edges are smoothed. The wound is closed with needle and thread. A competent Civil War surgeon could perform an amputation in roughly 10 to 15 minutes, sometimes faster, not because the work was easy, but because it had to be efficient. The soldier's danger did not end when the operation did, but speed could reduce the strain of the procedure itself and allow the surgeon to move to the next case. I want you to pause on the sound of that room for a moment, because the surgeon's tent was not silent except for occasional dramatic cries. It had its own working language. Water, more light, hold steady, bring the dressing, where is the tourniquet, lift this side, take him out carefully. The operating team developed an economy of speech because long explanations consumed energy they did not have. Instruments were set down, basins shifted, boots moved over plank, dirt or straw. A lantern rattled when someone brushed past it. Outside the tent a man groaned as another stretcher was lowered. Inside, the surgeon did not look up unless he had to. His world had narrowed to a wound, a judgment, and the obligation to finish the work cleanly enough by the standards of his day. And those standards were not ours. This is important to say plainly. Civil War surgeons did not practice antiseptic surgery in the modern sense because germ theory had not yet transformed medicine. They might wash their hands. They might clean visibly dirty instruments, but they did not sterilize as a modern surgeon would. W. W. Keane later described operating in clothing marked by prior work, using instruments that had not been disinfected, and reusing sponges after simple rinsing. To us this is horrifying because we know what they did not. To them, the invisible cause of infection had not yet become a medical certainty. Many patients who survived the knife later faced fever, pus, and deadly post-operative infection in the days that followed. That knowledge should keep us from judging the surgeon too quickly. He's not a caricature standing over a table with reckless enthusiasm. He's a physician working within the scientific boundaries of his era and inside circumstances that make every weakness of that science more severe. He has no antibiotics, no blood transfusion service in the modern sense, no sterile operating room, no reliable imaging, no intensive care unit waiting at the end of the procedure. His tools are skill, speed, experience, judgment, and whatever. Supplies reach the hospital before the wounded did. When he decides knowing that delay may be as dangerous as action. A fresh patient is brought in before the table has fully been cleared. The assistants lift the operated man away, still unconscious or just beginning to stir. He will be taken to a place for post-operative care, placed among others whose lives now depend on rest, dressing, nourishment, and whether infection comes. The table is wiped as well as possible. Instruments are gathered. The surgeon drinks perhaps a swallow of water or nothing at all. The next stretcher comes forward. There is no reset in the way we imagine one. The work simply continues. If you stand near the side of the tent, you begin to see differences in the surgeons themselves. One is older, his movements economical because he has learned not to waste strength. Another is younger and unusually pale, fighting to keep his concentration steady under the pressure of so many cases. A third has blood on his cuffs from hours earlier and no opportunity to change. Field hospitals were instructed to assign skilled operating surgeons, but skill did not erase fatigue. Some surgeons worked through long stretches after major battles, and the demands placed on them could be enormous. Letterman's own reports repeatedly emphasised the need to bring in additional surgeons to complete urgent operations promptly when local staffs could not manage all the wounded in time. There may be consultation in doubtful cases. Letterman's hospital plan called for operating surgeons to confer when a case was uncertain and to decide by majority. That detail matters because it complicates the old image of a single authoritarian surgeon making instant choices without reflection. In serious cases, decisions could be discussed, weighed, and argued quietly, even while the hospital throbbed with urgency around them. A limb that one surgeon believes must come off another may hope to preserve. A patient who appears strong enough for surgery at first glance may be too far gone on closer examination. These judgments were imperfect. They were also grave. The surgeon did not merely remove or spare tissue. He shaped the rest of a man's life, or failed to save it. Consider what the patient would have known before losing consciousness. He might have watched others carried out before him. He may have heard men awaken in pain after surgery and ask what was done. He may have seen a pile of removed limbs nearby, as many witnesses later described around busy operating stations after great battles, though even that grim image varied from place to place and circumstance to circumstance. He may have seen the surgeon point toward one table and not another, seen an assistant readying bandages, smelled chloroform in the air, and understood that his body now belonged for a few minutes to strangers trying to save him. It is difficult to imagine a more complete surrender of control, and yet inside that surrender there was also relief. Pain narrowed by anesthesia, action after hours of waiting, a surgeon finally examining what had happened, the possibility that a decision, however terrible, might mean mourning remained possible. We are accustomed to thinking of surgery as frightening even now, with bright sterile rooms and entire teams prepared around us. In a Civil War field hospital, the fear came without the comfort of modern assurances. But it was not hopeless. Many men survived operations, many amputees returned home, built lives, learned to work differently, and carried the hospital night with them for decades after. The operating table was not simply a place of loss. It was also sometimes the narrow bridge between the battlefield and a future. Outside the tent, the wounded who can still think clearly try to interpret the room from scraps of sound. They cannot see everything. Canvas blocks the view. A wall may stand between them and the table, but they hear orders. They hear movement. They smell chloroform and damp wool. They notice how long one patient remains inside. They count stretchers going in and stretchers coming out, though the counting becomes unreliable as the night drags on. One man tells another that the surgeons know what they're doing. Another says nothing at all. The reassurance may be offered for the speaker as much as for the listener. A hospital steward passes through carrying bandages and medicine. Another assistant lifts a lamp. Closer. Someone near the entrance is recording names and injuries as rapidly as possible. Letterman's hospital organisation called for detailed records of every case received, including identity, wound, treatment, operation and outcome, along with responsibility for marking graves when patients died. It is one of those administrative facts that feels cold until you understand what it meant. In a place where men arrived by the hundreds, records were an attempt to prevent them from disappearing entirely into the war. A name written down could reach a regiment, a marked grave could be found, a family might one day receive more than silence. In the corner of the tent, a small pile of surgical cases sits open or half open. Within them are the tools of the night: knives, saws, forceps, probes, scissors, needles. To modernise, the instruments look almost too simple for the weight of the work demanded of them. But they were specialised tools, and a trained surgeon knew their use. The problem was not that he lacked instruments in every case. though shortages certainly occurred. The problem was that the injuries were severe, the patient load enormous, and infection always waiting beyond the edge of current understanding. Civil War surgery was neither primitive savagery nor modern medicine in an earlier costume. It was a difficult professional practice caught in a brutal middle ground, advanced enough to do much, not yet advanced enough to prevent many of the worst consequences. The lantern burns lower. Someone trims it. The flame steadies. The surgeon's shadow grows and shrinks against the canvas with every movement. Another patient is laid down. This one is younger than the last, or perhaps he only looks younger because fear has stripped away the confidence he wore that morning. The surgeon asks a question. The patient answers weakly. The assistant prepares the anaesthetic again. No one in the tent remarks on the repetition. Repetition is how the hospital survives the night. Each case is singular to the man on the table. To the surgeon, each case must also become part of a sequence or the work cannot continue. There is a harsh kind of discipline in that. The surgeon cannot mourn fully over each wound. He cannot linger on every face. He cannot imagine each man's mother, wife, child, or field back home. Not now. He will break if he does. Instead, he examines, decides, operates, moves on. This does not mean he feels nothing. It means feeling cannot be allowed to interfere with the next patient's chance. Medical memoirs and official reports from the war show deep pride in careful attendance to the wounded, but they also reveal a profession forced to think in systems because individual suffering had become too vast to manage one case at a time. Now imagine stepping back outside the operating space for just a moment and looking at the tent from the hospital yard. It glows softly against the dark, almost warm from a distance. A stranger passing far away might think there was a meeting inside, or officers bent over maps. But you know what that light means. It means a surgeon has not stopped. It means someone is being examined. It means someone is being put under chloroform. It means an assistant is holding a lamp close while another holds a limb steady. It means the night is still making demands of the people within. And as the hours pass, the surgeon's tent begins to draw others toward it. Not only the wounded, but those whose labour gathers around the table without always standing at its centre. Nurses carry water and nourishment. Volunteers help dress wounds. Hospital workers steady men before and after procedures. Women who were not expected by many early military officials to enter such places prove, night after night, that the hospital cannot function on surgery alone. The surgeon's knife may decide one immediate crisis, but the human work around that knife is what keeps the entire place from collapsing into chaos. By the time the surgeon turns toward the next patient, someone else has already begun caring for the man who just left the table. He's carried away, still drifting under the effects of chloroform, his face slack with exhaustion, his body altered in a way he may not fully understand when he wakes. The surgeon's work has ended for the moment. Another kind of work takes over immediately. A blanket must be arranged, a dressing must be watched for fresh bleeding. A cup of water may be offered when the man can swallow. Someone needs to make sure he does not roll awkwardly onto the wound. Someone needs to notice if his breathing changes, if his skin grows colder, if he begins calling out in confusion. That someone might be a trained hospital steward. It might be a male attendant assigned to the ward. In some places it might be a soldier detailed from his regiment because more hands were needed. But in the hospitals that filled the American Civil War, especially as the conflict lengthened and the need for care became impossible to deny, that someone might also be a woman moving quietly from cot to cot in a plain dress, sleeves rolled back, apron marked by the labour of the night. Not every Civil War hospital had women present in the same number or in the same role. Women were more commonly seen in larger general hospitals than in the immediate surgical spaces nearest the battlefield. Yet in field hospitals, after great battles, in civilian homes transformed into wards, in relief stations near the fighting, and in the long chain of hospitals that received men after removal from the front, women became part of the war's medical landscape in a way the United States had never seen before. This change did not happen smoothly. At the beginning of the war, many military officials resisted the idea of women serving in army hospitals. The work was considered physically harsh, morally dangerous, and unsuitable for respectable women. Hospitals were crowded with sick and wounded men. Many patients were filthy from campaign life, feverish from disease, or badly injured in ways that required intimate bodily care. Some surgeons believed women would be a distraction. Others doubted they could endure the sights and smells of military wards. Dorothea Dix, already famous before the war for her reform work in care for the mentally ill, was appointed Superintendent of Army Nurses for the Union in June 1861 and began recruiting women under strict rules designed partly to answer those objections. She wanted nurses who were mature, disciplined, plainly dressed, and unlikely, in the eyes of anxious male administrators, to turn a hospital into a social parlour. Dix's standards could be severe and sometimes frustrating, but they also helped force open a role that did not previously exist in the military establishment. The woman stepping through the hospital room tonight may have come under Dix's authority. She may have arrived through the United States Sanitary Commission, a civilian relief organisation founded in 1861 to support the medical needs of Union soldiers with supplies, inspection, transportation and care. She may have come independently, attached herself to a hospital by sheer persistence, or followed a regiment connected to her family or community. She might be well known later, as Clara Barton became. She might be remembered only in a letter, or not remembered by name at all. The war produced famous nurses, but it depended just as heavily on thousands of women whose work was folded into the routine of hospitals and then largely lost from public memory. Look closely at what she's doing. It is not one dramatic task. It is 10 smaller tasks, then 10 more, all of them necessary. She kneels beside a soldier who has not eaten since morning and lifts a spoonful of broth or gruel to his lips. She changes a dressing when instructed and wipes away blood that has seeped through. She carries water, not only for drinking but for cleaning faces, hands and wounds as best the hospital can manage. She reads a letter aloud to a man whose eyes are swollen shut or who cannot hold the paper. She writes a reply for another, taking down the words slowly because he is weak and stops often. She asks a patient his name and regiment because the clerk missed him during the rush. She watches a young soldier fighting to remain composed, while men around him cry out and speaks to him calmly enough that he gets through the next few minutes without falling apart. Duties recorded for women nurses during and after battles included administering medicines, feeding soldiers, reading to them, writing letters, washing patients, helping identify the dead, and sometimes assisting with dressings or transportation arrangements. The work required more stamina than ceremony. It is easy to think of the nurse as someone who arrives after surgery once the most terrible moment has passed. In reality, her work often began long before the operation and continued long after it. At Antietam, Clara Barton reached the field with desperately needed supplies, including bandages and lanterns. As darkness came on, her lanterns allowed surgeons to continue working. She and those assisting her prepared simple food and carried it to wounded and dying men where they lay. Barton did not fit neatly into one official title that day. She served as supplier, relief worker, cook, and bedside caregiver wherever the need appeared. Her fame later rested partly on the fact that she came unusually close to the battlefield, but what she did there reveals the broader truth of nursing labour in war. Care was not confined to one assignment. It followed need. The hospital room itself is full of places where a nurse is needed without ever standing at the centre of attention. A man has awakened from anaesthesia and is trying to sit up because he thinks he's still on the battlefield. She presses a hand to his shoulder and tells him to lie still. Another is shivering hard despite the warmth of the room, his body reacting to blood loss and shock. She finds a blanket, or if there are none to spare, she tucks his coat more tightly around him. A soldier with a head wound keeps tearing at the bandage because he is confused. She redirects his hand again and again until he tires. A man who has lost a leg does not ask at first what happened. He asks whether the pain in his foot will stop, not yet understanding that the foot is gone. She may know what the surgeon did. She may wait for the doctor to explain. Either way, she hears the question. Some of these women were experienced caregivers before they ever reached a military hospital. Others learned under pressure. Many 19th century women had practical knowledge of home nursing because illness and childbirth were managed within households far more often than they are now. But a Civil War ward expanded that familiar work until it became something harsher and more relentless. Instead of one feverish child, there might be 50 men with typhoid. Instead of one injured family member, there could be rows of soldiers recovering from amputations, gunshot wounds, diarrhea, dysentery, pneumonia, or malaria. Disease killed more Civil War soldiers than battlefield wounds, and hospital nursing involved constant attention to sickness as well as trauma. The nurse of this night may have spent earlier weeks bathing fevered men and emptying basins in a general hospital before being sent closer to the front after a major battle. She's tired before midnight, not mildly tired, bone tired. Her lower back hurts from bending over beds. Her hands smell of broth, soap, medicine, sweat, and whatever else the night has required. Her shoes are damp if she has crossed the yard repeatedly. The hem of her skirt has brushed mud, straw, and floorboards marked by heavy traffic. Still, she continues because the room does not slow down, simply because she needs rest. Men who can wait politely at first become frantic when pain rises. Those who are quiet may become delirious. Someone begins coughing violently. Someone else calls for a drink, then forgets he asked, then calls again. A lantern flickers near the far wall. She moves toward it automatically because if it goes out, that corner of the room becomes harder to watch. The work demands not only tenderness, but judgment. A nurse must learn which patient is merely restless and which one is worsening. Which man needs a doctor now and which can be comforted until the doctor is free? Which cup belongs to which patient? Which medicine has been given? Which fever seems ordinary by hospital standards, and which has changed suddenly? Civil War hospitals often lacked the clear professional boundaries we would expect today, so women who began by bringing food and comfort could become trusted observers whose reports mattered to surgeons. At City Point, women nurses took on responsibilities that included supervising male nurses assigned to them, dressing wounds, feeding and washing patients, identifying dead soldiers, and helping arrange transportation home for the seriously wounded. That range of duties shows how quickly indispensable labour becomes authority when institutions are overwhelmed. Not every caregiver in the hospital fits the tidy image later generations preferred. Catholic sisters served in large numbers during the Civil War, more than 600 women from over 30 religious communities according to Library of Congress materials. Their vows, discipline, and experience in charitable work made them effective hospital nurses, and they became familiar figures in wards across the country. At Antietam, the Daughters of Charity responded in the aftermath of battle. In other places, religious sisters staffed major hospitals and worked aboard hospital ships. Their presence mattered in practical terms, but it also challenged anti-Catholic prejudices common in 19th century America. Men who might once have distrusted them often remembered their care with gratitude. There were also black women whose wartime medical work deserves far more attention than it long received. Susie King Taylor, born enslaved in Georgia, escaped during the war and served with the 33rd United States Colored Troops, officially as a laundress, but in practice as teacher, caretaker, and nurse. She cared for sick and wounded black soldiers, and later became the only African-American woman known to publish a memoir of her Civil War service. Her experience reminds us that the history of nursing in the war was shaped by race as well as gender. Black soldiers often faced unequal treatment within military systems, and black women who cared for them did so in a world that still denied them formal recognition, even when their labour was essential. Imagine how different that labour could feel, depending on where one stood in American society. A middle-class white woman from the north might enter nursing through a relief society, bringing with her education, letters of introduction, and the possibility of later publishing her recollections. A Catholic sister entered as part of a disciplined religious order. A black woman might perform nursing work while being denied the title, the pay, or the authority granted to others. A local civilian near a battlefield might be pulled into care overnight because her house had become a hospital, and there was no refusing the wounded on the floor. At Gettysburg, girls and women who had expected nothing more extraordinary than surviving the battle found themselves feeding, washing and tending wounded soldiers in homes, churches and improvised hospitals. The war did not ask all women to serve in the same way. It took hold of them through whatever door was nearest. There is a woman in this room tonight who has been sitting beside one soldier longer than she intended. He is badly wounded and seems to know it. He asks whether she can write a few words to his wife if he cannot do it himself. She finds paper when she can. It may not be good paper. It may be borrowed from hospital stores, folded from a notebook, or torn from whatever is available. She asks him what to say. He begins with practical information because people often do when they are frightened. Tell her I was struck in the leg. Tell her I was brought to a hospital. Tell her not to worry too much. Then the words change. Tell her I thought of the children. Tell her I have her letter. Tell her I tried to do my duty. Nurses and relief workers often wrote letters for wounded men, a task that could become more emotionally demanding than dressing a wound because it required sitting with someone's fear without looking away. Nearby, another woman is preparing food. That may sound almost domestic in a way that softens the scene, but food in a wartime hospital was medical care. A man weak from blood loss or fever needed nourishment he could tolerate. Gruel, broth, tea, bread softened enough to swallow, simple items that required time and someone willing to make them properly. Mary Ann Bickerdike, one of the most formidable relief workers of the war, became famous for doing precisely the practical things that officers often failed to arrange quickly enough. She followed Union armies, organised field hospitals, secured supplies, and did whatever was needed on behalf of soldiers who came to know her as Mother Bickerdike. Her reputation came from action, not ceremony. In a hospital at night, the woman heating broth over a stove or fire may not know her name, but she belongs to the same category of wartime labour, the kind that sees a need and begins meeting it before anyone has filed a request. The hospital contains many kinds of pain, and nurses have to move among all of them. There is the loud pain of a fresh wound. There is the dull pain of a man recovering from surgery. There is the restless misery of fever. There is the shame of soldiers who must be washed or helped like children after having marched into battle that morning as proud adults. There is the loneliness of those far from home. A surgeon may see the wound first. A nurse sees what happens when the man realises the wound has changed his life. She sees who cannot sleep, who refuses food, who turns his face to the wall after receiving news from the surgeon, who brightens when a letter is placed in his hand, who lies about being comfortable because he does not want to trouble her. This is not secondary work. It is the work that fills the hours between medical decisions. Some women gained soldiers' trust precisely because they brought something the military environment lacked. Not softness in any fragile sense, but attention that was not purely procedural. They noticed when a blanket slipped. They remembered a man's name. They found ways to preserve a little privacy in a room with none. They spoke more gently than exhausted officers sometimes could. That did not make them sentimental creatures wandering through war with handkerchiefs. Many were blunt, some were fiercely practical. Some quarrelled with surgeons and quartermasters to obtain what patients needed. The stereotype of the angelic nurse obscures how much stubbornness, physical strength, and administrative force the role required. Barton fought to reach battlefields with supplies. Bickerdike bullied systems into better behaviour. Dix tried to impose order on a national nursing effort. These women did not soothe history from the sidelines. They pushed into spaces that had not been built for them and made themselves necessary there. The night moves forward. A wounded man finally falls asleep after calling repeatedly for water. Another wakes and asks where his blanket came from. A nurse does not tell him that it was taken from a stack meant for someone else, because he needed it more urgently. She simply says he has it now and should rest. At the far end of the room, a surgeon requests assistance. A woman nearby may not enter the operation itself, because direct assistance in surgery was not the typical role assigned to women nurses in these settings. But she brings what is asked for, clears the way, receives the next patient, or helps care for the previous one. The operating table draws attention, but the hospital survives only because so many people keep the rest of the room functioning while the surgeon works. It would be comforting to imagine that compassion made these hospitals peaceful in some corner of the night. It did not. Nurses worked inside the same harsh reality as everyone else. They breathed foul air. They encountered blood, amputated limbs, infected wounds, vomit, excrement, and the constant risk of disease. Some fell ill themselves. Mary Morris' husband, who nursed at Camp Letterman after Gettysburg, eventually had to leave after contracting a fever. The line between caregiver and patient could narrow quickly in 19th century hospitals, especially when exhaustion lowered resistance and sanitation remained limited by the medical understanding of the day. Even so, many stayed as long as they could. The work had changed them. Some later wrote memoirs. Others returned quietly to lives that seemed ordinary from the outside but could never fully be untouched by what they had seen. Those who spent nights among the wounded knew things most civilians never learned. They knew what battle did after newspapers stopped describing the charge. They knew how young soldiers looked when pain stripped away bravado. They knew how often courage appeared not in dramatic speeches, but in a man trying not to groan while someone changed his bandage. They knew that death often came quietly after long attention, not in the instant of a musket volley. They knew that survival required more than surgeons. It required sustained care, repeated through dark hours by people whose names might never appear in a military report. The woman who wrote one soldier's letter has moved on to another cot. The broth has cooled enough to serve. A fresh wagon is heard outside. The operating tent still glows. Men continue to wait in the yard, on blankets, on stretchers, along walls, watching every movement that might signal their turn. Nurses pass among them with cups, cloths, bandages, medicine, and brief words of reassurance, but they cannot answer the one question almost everyone is carrying. How long until they call my name? That question settles over the hospital, more heavily as the night deepens. The wounded hear the surgeons working. They hear nurses moving beside them. They hear the wagons bringing more men than the hospital can easily hold. They listen to cries, whispered prayers, boots crossing floors, wheels in the yard, and sometimes the soft scratch of a pen finishing someone else's letter home. For those still waiting, sound becomes its own kind of forecast, and every sound seems to promise something about what may happen next. The men who are still waiting do not need to see the surgeon's table to know that it is busy. They hear enough. A lamp being moved, a stretcher lowered, a short order given in a tired voice, a basin set down on wood, the canvas flap opening and closing, boots scraping against packed earth, a man somewhere inside asking once what will become of his arm, another voice answering too quietly to make out. Then the room settles into motion again, and the wounded outside continue listening because there is nothing else to do. Waiting in a Civil War field hospital was not passive. It required a kind of effort all its own. A man had to keep himself from panicking while pain rose and fell without warning. He had to resist asking every passing orderly whether his turn had come. He had to decide whether the cry he had just heard came from someone being moved, someone being operated on, or someone who had just awakened and discovered what the surgeon had done. He had to listen to sounds he could not fully explain, and when people are frightened, the mind fills every gap with possibility. The hospital at night had no single dominant noise. It had layers. Closest at hand might be the breathing of the man lying beside you, shallow and irregular. Beyond that, someone murmuring a prayer under his breath. Farther off, a nurse or steward asking for more water. A wagon rattling in again from the field. Horses stamping outside. the low discussion of surgeons deciding what to do next, and beneath all of it, rising and falling at uneven intervals, the wounded themselves, men moaning in their sleep, men crying out when bandages were changed, men calling for mothers, wives, brothers, God, men trying to be silent and failing when the pain suddenly caught them off guard. John Dooley, a wounded Confederate after Gettysburg, wrote that at night the groans and shrieks and ravings of the wounded became more impressive than in daylight, while exhausted men managed only broken sleep. Walt Whitman, moving among wartime hospital wards, likewise described hearing groans and other sounds of intense suffering, though he also noted that much of the room remained unnervingly quiet. That mixture matters. We tend to imagine suffering as loud because loud suffering is easy to dramatise. But many wounded soldiers were quiet. Some were trying to preserve dignity. Some were too weak for noise. Some had entered that narrow inward state brought on by shock, exhaustion, and blood loss. Their silence did not mean comfort. Whitman noticed the pallid face, the dulled eye, and the moisture on the lip as signs of pain when words and cries had receded. In a hospital where one man was shouting, another might lie inches away entirely still, gripping a blanket in his fist so tightly that the cloth twisted around his fingers. If you were lying there waiting, you would begin to recognise the difference between the sounds of the hospital and the sounds of the battlefield beyond it. Earlier in the day, the battlefield had been a wall of noise. Riley Hoskinson, observing combat near Chattanooga in 1863, described cannon fire too rapid to count, musketry like salt thrown into a fire, officers shouting, caissons racing, and wounded men groaning and crying out amid the movement. A battlefield overwhelmed the ear all at once. A hospital at night separated those sounds into smaller pieces and made you hear each one more clearly. The crack of gunfire became, at a distance, something occasional. The cries nearby became unavoidable. That change could be worse than the battle itself. During fighting, noise swallowed thought. A man ran, loaded, fired, obeyed, crouched, rose, and moved again because everyone around him was doing the same. Afterward, when he lay on a blanket or stretcher with his wound bandaged only roughly, and no immediate task left except waiting, sound had room to settle into him. He could hear the ambulance wheels receding and wonder if they were going back, for a friend. He could hear another wagon arriving and wonder how many more had been hit. He could hear the surgeon's tent and understand that the length of one operation meant delay for every man behind it. Sometimes the most unnerving sound was not a cry at all, but a pause. The surgeon's tent would fall briefly quiet after intense movement. No one outside knew whether that meant an operation had ended successfully, whether another patient was being prepared, or whether something had gone wrong. This silence might last 10 seconds. It might last a minute. To the wounded who were listening, it could feel much longer. Then came another order, another movement, another patient carried in. The hospital began breathing again. Near the entrance, one man keeps asking whether the surgeon has been told about him. His arm has been struck badly, but he is conscious, and because he is conscious, he has begun to measure time in footsteps. Every person passing becomes a possible answer. Every set of boots that turns toward him raises hope, then takes it away when the boots continue past. A nurse tells him they know he is there. He nods. 5 minutes later he asks again. This is not impatience in the ordinary sense. It is what fear does when it has been given no schedule. Another man nearby has stopped asking. He was talkative when he arrived, explaining what happened, where he was hit, which regiment he belonged to, and how long he had waited on the field. Now he listens only. When the tent flap opens, he turns his head slightly. When a patient is carried out, he watches the stretcher without moving the rest of his body. He's trying to understand the future by studying what happens to other men. The wounded had reason to listen closely. What they heard could tell them whether they might be next for surgery, whether water was coming, whether wagons were still bringing casualties, whether the surgeons were gaining ground or falling behind. Organised ambulance systems improved evacuation as the war progressed, and at Antietam in September 1862, hundreds of ambulances worked through the night to clear Union wounded from the field and bring them towards surgical care. But from the perspective of a wounded man already waiting at the hospital, efficient evacuation had a complicated sound. Every arriving ambulance meant rescue for someone. It also meant more bodies entering the queue ahead of certainty. At intervals, the hospital's soundscape shifted when fresh wounded arrived in a group. The yard outside grew louder first, drivers calling to horses, bearers lifting stretchers, a man crying out as he was moved, boots approaching. Then the room or tent took them in. The clerk or steward asked for names. Someone answered for those unable to answer themselves. Clothing rustled as coats were cut away. A patient already waiting heard all of this and understood that the night had just become longer. There were also sounds that suggested care rather than danger, and the wounded learned to distinguish those as well. The dip of a ladle into a bucket, a tin cup set down beside a cot, paper unfolding, a pen scratching across a letter. Women nurses, relief workers, chaplains, stewards and visitors often wrote on behalf of soldiers too weak or injured to correspond with family. Walt Whitman became famous for doing exactly this in Washington hospitals, helping men communicate when their hands, strength, or circumstances failed them. In the field hospital, the same act might happen more hurriedly and with less calm, but the sound of writing still meant that one man's words were moving outward, away from the hospital toward home. A soldier lying near that sound might begin composing his own letter silently. He may not ask yet. He may want to wait until the surgeon tells him more. But he is already choosing phrases in his mind. Tell them I was wounded but cared for. Tell Father I did not disgrace myself. Tell Mary not to be frightened. Tell them my leg may be saved if he still believes that. Tell them nothing final, not yet. A scratch of ink in a crowded hospital could awaken thoughts of home more strongly than any speech. Prayer had its own place in the night. Not always formal, not always spoken loudly, and not always led by a chaplain. Some men prayed from habit. Some prayed because the hospital had stripped away every illusion of control. Some who had not prayed in years began. Others asked another man to pray for them because their own words felt too scattered. In Civil War hospitals, chaplains, Christian Commission delegates and other religious workers circulated among the wounded, offering scripture, conversation and comfort. But even without one present, prayer moved through the room in fragments, a whispered line from a psalm, a promise made to God, a soldier repeating the same phrase because it was the only thing he could hold on to. The wounded also heard the nurses speaking, and that mattered perhaps more than the words themselves. A steady voice could briefly order the chaos. Rest now. Drink slowly. Do not pull at that bandage. The doctor will come. Your friend has been brought in. We are looking for him. Some statements were certain. Others were kinder than they were verifiable. Yet tone carried weight. In a crowded room where fear moved faster than any official explanation, calm speech became a form of treatment. Not every sound brought relief. Men waiting within earshot of the operating area could sometimes hear the heavy rhythm of movement around amputations. There is no need to exaggerate it. Civil War patients undergoing major operations were generally anaesthetized with chloroform or ether, so the dramatic image of the conscious patient screaming through every cut is misleading. But anesthesia did not erase every disturbing sound around surgery. There were instructions from surgeons. There was the shifting of bodies. There were instruments placed down and picked up again. There were patients entering and later being carried away. There were men waking in pain or confusion afterward. For someone still waiting, the imagination made use of all of it. The saw itself has become one of the most overused symbols of Civil War medicine, but it would be dishonest to pretend it was absent. Amputation was a major part of wartime surgical practice. because bullets and shell fragments could destroy limbs beyond the ability of contemporary medicine to repair. Men in or near operating areas may well have heard the work of those procedures, though the louder and more persistent memory in many first-hand accounts is not one instrument, but the collective distress surrounding the wounded. The fear of surgery did not depend on hearing a saw clearly. It depended on knowing that others were being taken in and altered before your turn arrived. nps.gov. One man hears a patient carried out and asks the nurse beside him whether the fellow survived. She may not know. She may say only that he is through the operation. The distinction matters. Through the operation is not the same as safe. Everyone in the hospital understands it, though no one says it each time. Surgery was one danger. The days afterward held others, especially infection, fever, and complications that physicians of the 1860s could not control, as modern medicine later would. But a wounded man waiting at midnight is often focused on the next hour, not the next week. He wants to know whether he will reach the table alive, whether the surgeon will decide quickly, whether pain will be relieved, whether his body will remain his own. nps.gov. The passage of time becomes strangely uncertain in such a room. Without a clock visible, and with lanterns replacing the movement of the sun, a man may feel that hours have passed when it has been 20 minutes. Another may awaken and believe he slept half the night, when he closed his eyes only briefly. Sound becomes the measure of time. 3 wagons since he last asked for water. 2 operations since the nurse promised to return. 1 round of prayer at the far end of the ward. The hospital counts for him because he cannot count properly for himself. Outside the main tent, perhaps under a tree or along a fence line, men waiting in the open hear a slightly different hospital. The canvas muffles the surgeon's work, but the yard carries everything else. Wheels crunching, horses blowing, stretchers lowered into mud or grass, the clatter of canteens, orders called from one point to another, a sentry or orderly telling someone to clear the passage. The night air also brings sounds from farther away, sometimes the far-off firing of pickets, sometimes artillery rumbling after the main engagement has supposedly ended, sometimes nothing but crickets and the strange ordinary life of the countryside continuing around a place that has become unbearable. That contrast could be cruel. Birds might begin at dawn over fields where men had lain awake all night. Farm dogs might bark while surgeons kept working. The natural world did not pause because a hospital had filled. There are wounded men still on the battlefield too, not yet arrived, and the sounds there are different again. Lieutenant Charles A. Fuller, wounded at Gettysburg, remembered lying helpless in the wheat field while bullets still passed overhead. His account captures the transition from active combat to isolation. First the force of battle, then the realization that he could not move himself, then the waiting that came before removal. For men like him, the first sounds of rescue might be voices searching nearby, or stretcher-bearers moving through trampled grain. In the hospital, hearing each new wagon arrive meant remembering that others were still out there awaiting the same luck. Sometimes men waiting side by side began talking simply because listening alone had become intolerable. They exchanged regiments, hometowns, fragments of battles. One exaggerated, another corrected him. A third had no interest in conversation until someone mentioned a county near his own. Then he turned his head. These conversations could be short because pain interrupted them. They could also become oddly detailed, as if ordinary questions about farms, rivers, churches and weather offered proof that another world still existed somewhere beyond the hospital walls. Whitman noticed again and again how young many wounded soldiers were, and how isolated they often seemed, far from familiar faces. In that setting, a voice answering back could matter almost as much as medicine for a little while. There is a particular sound when someone recognizes another man. It cuts through everything. A name spoken sharply. A pause, then repeated louder. Sometimes the answer comes, sometimes it does not. 2 comrades separated on the field may meet again in a ward by chance. A brother may find a brother. A man searching stretcher after stretcher may finally stop because he has seen the face he needed to see. The cry that follows may be relief, grief, or both mixed together. Hospitals after major battles were full of such searches, with soldiers, civilians and relief workers trying to locate the missing among the wounded and dead. At night, recognition by voice could come before recognition by sight. A wounded man with his head bandaged cannot easily turn toward the door. He learns instead to judge events by sound. Heavy boots may belong to bearers. Quieter steps may belong to a nurse. A brisk step and a brief stop near the cot may mean a doctor. A patient carried in breathing hard may be fresh from the road. A patient carried out without speaking may have already exhausted his strength. This attention is not chosen. It grows out of helplessness. When the body cannot move, the ear does more work. Not all waiting men understood exactly what the sounds meant medically, but they understood hierarchy. The surgeon's voice carried authority. The clerk's questions meant a case was being entered into the hospital's world. The nurse's tone meant immediate comfort or immediate correction. The chaplain's murmured speech often meant someone was very frightened, very ill, or near death. The wheels outside meant the battle had not finished arriving. The longer a man lay there, the better he became at interpreting a place he had never wanted to know. There is also the sound of thirst. It seems odd to call thirst a sound, but in crowded hospitals it announced itself everywhere. Men asked for water repeatedly. They whispered it. They rasped it. Some begged for it. After battle, thirst could be overwhelming from exertion, blood loss, shock, and time spent lying exposed. John Dooley complained bitterly of poor water near Gettysburg, warm and muddy from a nearby run. Others remembered that water was the first thing the wounded asked for. Relief workers after Antietam described spending the night searching for comrades, caring for the injured, and writing to families by torchlight with little to offer many sufferers except water. The cup moving down the line becomes a sound men wait for. Metal touching metal, liquid sloshing slightly, a nurse saying only a little, another patient swallowing too fast and coughing, someone farther away asking when the water will come back. These are small noises. In a hospital night, small noises can occupy the whole mind. At some point, a man near the wall begins singing, very softly. It might be a hymn, it might be a camp song, it might last only a verse before he runs out of breath or someone nearby asks him to stop. But for a few moments, the sound changes the room. Not everyone welcomes it. Some are too much in pain. Some do not want reminders of home. Others listen without saying so. Music in wartime hospitals and camps could comfort, distract, or stir grief depending on the listener. Even a few lines hummed under the breath might remind men that they were still part of a world larger than the room. Lock.gov. The hospital continues in this way, not progressing neatly toward calm, but shifting from one concentration of sound to another. A busy burst near the entrance, a quiet stretch among the cots, a voice raised near the surgical area, a wagon from the field, a prayer, a pen, a groan, a cup, a name, a door, a question. Men waiting begin to dread some sounds and crave others. The worst sound may be one that belongs to no object at all, the sudden absence of a neighbour's breathing after hours of hearing it beside you. No one needs to announce what has happened. The stillness does it. And yet, many of the wounded remain awake. Sleep comes badly in such a place. Dooley remembered fitful slumbers among the injured at Gettysburg. Whitman observed that hospital suffering could exist amid a terrible quiet, the sort of quiet that does not soothe because it is too full of restraint. Men drifted off, startled awake, drifted again, each returned to consciousness marked by the realization that the room was still crowded, the lanterns still burning, the work still unfinished. The most patient among them are not necessarily less afraid. They may simply have understood more quickly that there is no bargaining with the order of the night. Surgeons will reach them when they can. Nurses will return when they can. Wagons will keep arriving until the field gives up no more wounded. Pain will rise and recede. The lamp will flicker. Somebody will cry out. Somebody will pray. Somebody will be called next. And there, in that long interval between arrival and treatment, between the battlefield and whatever comes after, the wounded learn the hospital by ear. They know it first not as a place of walls or tents or tables, but as a sequence of sounds in darkness. The war outside has not gone silent. It has changed rooms. By now the hospital has settled into a rhythm that no one would call calm, but everyone inside has begun to recognise. Wagons arrive. Stretchers pass through. A surgeon bends over another case. Nurses move from bed to bed. Those who can speak ask for water, for news, for a doctor, for someone to write home. Those who cannot speak lie very still and let the room move around them. And then there is pain. Not as one single sensation, not as a single scream arising from a single bed, but as the condition of the entire place. Pain in the man who has been shot through the shoulder and cannot find a position that does not send fire down his arm. Pain in the soldier whose leg has been shattered and who knows, though no one has confirmed it yet, that the surgeon may remove it. Pain in the man waking from chloroform with a bandaged stump where part of his body used to be. Pain in the abdomen, in the chest, in the head, in bones broken by impact, in flesh torn by shell fragments, in bruises from falls and wagon rides that barely register beside the larger wound. A Civil War field hospital was filled with men who had survived the battlefield only to discover that survival could hurt for a very long time. NPS.gov, NPS.gov. The surgeons and attendants were not indifferent to that suffering. They had medicines that could help. Opium was widely used for pain. Morphine was available. Laudanum, a tincture of opium mixed with alcohol, could be administered as well. At the field hospital, a wounded man might receive opium pills before transport or morphine after an operation. These drugs did not erase the hospital, and they did not reach everyone immediately, but they mattered. They softened pain when given in time. They lowered the sharpest edge of panic. They allowed a man to endure the hours after the surgeon had done what he could. NPS.gov, NPS.gov, NPS.gov. Still, pain relief in the 1860s was not the same as comfort in a modern recovery ward. Dosages were less precise. Supplies varied. The hospital might be overwhelmed. A surgeon could know exactly what a man needed and still be unable to provide it at once because another operation was already underway, because attendants were stretched thin, because the medicine chest had to serve many more patients than anyone had expected before the battle began. The wounded man did not experience this as a logistical problem. He experienced it as minutes becoming longer than they should be. He heard someone nearby receive relief and wondered when his turn would come. NPS.gov, NPS.gov. Near the operating area, another patient is being prepared. He has waited long enough to understand that his wound is serious. A surgeon has examined him. Assistants have shifted closer. A cloth is brought toward his face, dampened with chloroform. This is the moment popular memory has often gotten wrong. Civil War surgeons did use anaesthesia, and they used it extensively. Chloroform and ether had been part of American medical practice since the 1840s, and during the war chloroform became especially common because it acted quickly and was easier to use in field conditions. The patient was generally put to sleep before major surgery began. The hospital was brutal, but it was not usually the place of fully conscious amputations that later legend made so familiar. NPS.gov, pmc.ncbi.nlm.nih.gov. The soldier inhales. At first he may tense against it. Chloroform had a sharp, unfamiliar smell. He may cough. He may mutter something that does not quite form into a sentence. The assistant keeps the cloth in place, watching him closely. His hand, clenched over the edge of the table, begins to slacken. His face loses some of its strain. The room around him becomes unsteady, then absent. The surgeon waits only until the anaesthetic has taken hold. There is no time for solemnity. Another man waits outside. Another wagon is on the road. Another patient will need this table before the lantern burns much lower. NPS.gov. NPS.gov. For those waiting nearby, the use of chloroform is reassuring in one way and frightening in another. It means the surgeon will not cut while the man is fully awake. That matters deeply. But it also marks the beginning of something irreversible. The patient goes under with his body one way and wakes with it another. Men waiting their turn understood this. They watched stretchers enter the operating space and emerge later. They counted blankets. They looked for the outline of limbs beneath them. Some asked questions, others did not need to. NPS.gov. When the patient is brought out, he's no longer in the worst moment of the operation, but neither is he at peace. Civil War anaesthetics wore off. Post-operative pain arrived. At the Gettysburg Field Hospital model described by the National Park Service, soldiers were awakened after surgery and morphine administered for pain. That sequence is useful to imagine because it reveals how abrupt the return could be. A man might come back to consciousness confused, nauseated, weak, and aching in a way that at first made no sense. He may move instinctively and be stopped. He may ask what happened. He may receive the answer gently, or bluntly, or not yet, depending on the room and the people available. NPS.gov. One man begins to wake and tries to lift himself. A nurse steadies him at once. He asks if the surgeon saved the leg. She glances toward the doctor, but he's already occupied. There is a pause no longer than a breath, and the man understands before anyone speaks. His face tightens. Perhaps he says nothing. Perhaps he asks again, this time with less hope. The nurse tells him to lie back. She gives him water if he can take it. She waits for the medicine to do what it can. Around them, the hospital continues as if this private catastrophe has not altered the world. For him, it has. Pain also created strange distortions of time. A wound suffered during battle might seem almost distant once hours of transport, examination, waiting and surgery had passed. The soldier could remember the moment of impact clearly, or not at all. Some men reported feeling relatively little pain at first, then far more later when shock wore away. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, gravely wounded near Petersburg in June 1864, later recalled that he did not feel much pain at the moment of injury, describing instead a dull, stunned tension as he lay bleeding on the field. Only later, in the makeshift hospital, did the agony become more prominent. That change from shock to suffering marked many. Wounded men's passage into the hospital night. Battlefields.org. Chamberlain's account also captures another truth of these hours. Surgeons sometimes believed a patient would not survive until morning. Chamberlain was told, in substance, that his wound appeared mortal. He wrote a farewell note to his wife and children, prepared himself for death, and lay among badly wounded Union and Confederate officers as the light faded. Yet he survived the night. The man beside him, Colonel George Prescott, did not. In a field hospital before dawn, certainty was fragile. Some whom doctors feared would die lived. Some who seemed likely to recover worsened before anyone expected it. The night held all of them in suspension. Battlefields.org. That uncertainty is where prayer entered the room with particular force. Religion already occupied a central place in 19th century American life, and the armies of both sides included chaplains who preached, held services, distributed literature, and visited the sick and wounded. In hospitals, one of the chaplain's most important duties was to pray with dying men, record final words, write or relay messages to families, and offer spiritual comfort when medicine had reached its limit. Some chaplains also carried supplies, lifted patients, and helped with practical work when hospitals were short-staffed. But the bedside prayer remained central to how many soldiers understood the final hours of life. civilwarmed.org. A chaplain arrives beside a cot where a soldier has been quiet for some time. The man's face is damp, his breathing has changed. A nurse has already noticed and sent for someone. The chaplain kneels or bends close because the room is too loud for distant speech. He asks if the soldier wishes to pray. The man may nod. He may whisper the name of a church from home. He may ask the chaplain to tell his mother he remembered her. He may speak of his wife with sudden tenderness, as one Confederate soldier did in a recollection preserved by Chaplain Alexander Betts. The chaplain listens because listening is part of the ministry now. civilwarmed.org. The prayer itself might be simple. It might draw from familiar scripture. It might ask for mercy, courage, forgiveness, safe passage, or comfort for those far away who do not yet know what has happened. The soldier may repeat words he learned as a child. He may only listen. The chaplain's voice does not erase the sounds around them. Wagons still arrive. Surgeons still speak sharply over difficult cases. A man nearby may groan through clenched teeth while bandages are changed. But for a brief moment, the cot becomes its own small room within the larger room, defined by one man's fear and another man's attempt to meet it with a language that has been trusted for centuries. civilwarmed.org. Not every wounded soldier prayed. Not every prayer brought peace. Some men were angry, some were too weak. Some had no interest in spiritual conversation at all. A realistic hospital contains all of them. But it would be false to leave prayer out, because the historical record does not leave it out. Hospital chaplains, Christian commission workers, nurses, and fellow soldiers all described moments when prayer became part of care. In some wards, organised prayer meetings took place when circumstances allowed. In others, prayer belonged to the bedside, whispered because the man asking for it had no strength for anything louder. civilwarmed.org. loc.gov. The men who expected to live prayed too, though often for different things. A soldier waiting for surgery might pray that the anaesthetic worked, that the surgeon's hand was steady, that his wound would be less serious than it appeared, that a family at home would not receive the wrong kind of letter. A man who had lost a limb might pray before he had words for the future. Another, feverish and restless, might mutter fragments of scripture learned in childhood without knowing he was doing it. Hospitals were full of men who had marched for months through mud, slept in rain, cursed officers, joked under fire and fought with hard physical courage. Yet in the longest part of the night many reached back toward the earliest language of dependence they knew. civilwarmed.org. Meanwhile, medicine and prayer did not stand on opposite sides of the room. They operated together within the same reality. A chaplain prayed while a nurse held a cup. A surgeon administered chloroform while another patient whispered a hymn. A soldier received morphine and asked that a letter be written to his wife. The hospital did not divide neatly into the scientific and the spiritual. It held everything people had available for confronting suffering, because no one category of help seemed sufficient by itself. nps.gov. civilwarmed.org. The hours after midnight often felt different from the hours immediately after sunset. Earlier the hospital had run on urgency. The wounded arrived in waves. The operating tables filled. Men cried out while being moved. Drivers shouted. Attendants made room where there had been none. Later, as the deepest part of night approached, the urgency remained. But fatigue settled over it. Voices dropped when they could. Steps slowed slightly, then quickened again when needed. Some patients finally slept under the influence of opium or simple exhaustion. Others became more restless because pain worsened in the quiet. Lanterns smoked, candles shortened. The night acquired that heavy quality familiar to anyone who has stayed awake too long, when each ordinary task demands more attention than it should. WhitmanArchive.org, battlefields.org. Walt Whitman, visiting military hospitals during the war, wrote of spending hours beside wounded young men who clung to him, of staying near them when they wanted company, and of wards where the wounded lay on the ground in tents with little more than a blanket and pine or hemlock boughs beneath them. His hospital scenes were often away from the immediate battlefield, but the emotional truth carries directly into the field hospital night. Some suffering could not be eased by a procedure. It required presence, someone sitting nearby, someone not leaving too quickly, someone willing to remain while pain, fear and loneliness moved through a man who did not want to be alone with them. whitmanarchive.org. In the corner of the ward, a wounded soldier has been dozing fitfully. He wakes whenever another patient cries out, opens his eyes, and then closes them again, as if sleep can be forced by obedience. Beside him, another man cannot stop talking. He speaks of home, of a creek near his father's land, of the meal his mother makes in autumn, of an argument with his brother that suddenly seems foolish. A nurse listens when she can, but there are too many beds. Eventually a chaplain sits with him instead. The soldier's voice slows. Whether it is exhaustion, morphine, prayer, or simple relief at being heard, no one can say. Perhaps it is all of them. Elsewhere, a surgeon returns to a patient operated on earlier because bleeding has resumed. Bandages are removed. The wound is checked. The patient groans before fully waking. There is concern about secondary hemorrhage, a danger Civil War surgeons understood even though their treatments remained limited compared to modern medicine. In amputation cases, major blood vessels were tied off with ligatures, but complications could still follow. The hospital never fully moved beyond crisis. It carried one crisis into the next, layered over the hours. NPS.gov. Pain made men notice small things with unusual intensity. The roughness of straw beneath a shoulder, a blanket folded badly under the neck, the smell of chloroform lingering after the cloth was taken away, the warmth of a cup in the hand. The moment when opium began to dull a wound from a clean sharp torment into something heavier and farther away. The creak of a lantern hook, the hand of a nurse resting briefly against a fevered forehead. When the world narrows to a cot and a wound, details become enormous. Outside, the battlefield is still present, even if no one inside can see it. Some wounded have not yet been brought in. Some lie in improvised shelters nearer the field. Some are already dead and will be discovered more fully at daylight. Walt Whitman described nighttime arrivals of wounded from Chancellorsville, men lying on wharves and ground in the rain, waiting for ambulances, with torches casting limited light over bodies wrapped in bloody bandages. The field hospital shares that same cruel timetable. Darkness delays, darkness hides, darkness lengthens the time between injury and help. The men already under shelter know that others are still waiting beyond them. whitmanarchive.org. Those who remain conscious sometimes measure their luck against the suffering of others. Chamberlain wrote that his own agonizing pains were tempered in part by the misery of a badly wounded young Confederate officer lying nearby. This is not sentimental generosity. It is a human mind trying to locate itself within a crowded field of suffering. A man realizes that the person beside him, though wearing another uniform, is farther from home and perhaps worse off. He becomes less alone by recognizing another's pain. Even in the hospital, where the war's divisions are still visible, proximity can create a brief, reluctant fellowship. Battlefields.org. There are also moments when pain breaks through every attempt at control. A man who has endured quietly for hours suddenly cries out when someone shifts him. Another curses wildly after waking from surgery, then apologizes when the spasm passes. A third clamps his jaw so hard during a dressing change that afterward he cannot immediately speak. Nurses and stewards learn not to mistake composure for mild suffering or noise for weakness. Pain did not respect character. It moved through officers and privates, the devout and the sceptical, the brave and the frightened, in whatever manner the body allowed. whitmanarchive.org. nps.gov. The dead are not far away. In some hospitals, those who have just died are moved aside as soon as possible because space is needed. Chaplains may conduct brief services later if circumstances permit. Records may be made, personal belongings may be gathered, though not always promptly. The living see enough to understand what has happened even when no announcement is made. A nurse who had been tending one man suddenly covers his face. A chaplain rises slowly from a bedside. 2 attendants lift a still form with a care different from that used for the wounded. The room does not stop. That is perhaps the hardest part. Death enters, and the work continues. civilwarmed.org. At the same time, survival enters too. A patient whom the surgeons thought unlikely to last the night breathes more steadily after a difficult intervention. Another who had been nearly insensible becomes responsive enough to answer his name. A man awakens from chloroform and, after a few confused minutes, asks for water in a voice that sounds stronger than expected. These improvements are quiet, rarely celebrated in the moment because everyone is busy, but they are noticed. A nurse exchanges a glance with a surgeon. An assistant says he is holding better. The hospital has not won anything yet, but it has gained a little ground. Toward the last hours before dawn, the night seems longest. It is a familiar phenomenon even outside war. The body expects rest. The mind weakens. Lantern light begins to feel insufficient in a new way. In the hospital, those hours can appear almost suspended. Too late to believe the night is just beginning. Too early to claim morning. Those who have been awake since battle continue because they must. Surgeons continue. Nurses continue. Chaplains continue. The wounded continue. A man who has endured since afternoon may now have to endure the hardest stretch, when the promise of daylight is near enough to imagine but not yet visible. Battlefields.org. Whitmanarchive.org. One patient asks what hour it is. No one knows precisely. Another says it must be nearly morning because the air has changed. He may be right. Before dawn, the night cools differently. Outside, the eastern edge of the sky will eventually begin to pale, though inside the hospital lamps still command the room. The first signs of morning do not bring immediate relief. They reveal. They show the full extent of what darkness partly concealed. Mud on the floor, blood-stiffened bandages, faces drawn by pain and sleeplessness, nurses whose aprons are no longer clean, surgeons who have aged visibly over a single night, men who survived until dawn and men who did not. Chamberlain later remembered that at dawn Prescott was dead and he himself still alive. That simple contrast says a great deal about the longest hours before morning. A night in a Civil War field hospital was not passed in sleep, and it was not measured merely by clocks. It was measured by who was still breathing when the light returned, whose pain had eased, whose had worsened, whose prayer had ended in sleep, whose letter home would need finishing, whose place on the floor would soon be taken by another wounded man arriving after sunrise. Battlefields.org. The lanterns burn on, though their necessity is fading. Someone notices a line of grey light beyond the tent flap. A nurse adjusts a blanket around a man who has finally dozed. A surgeon rubs at his eyes and turns toward yet another case. A chaplain rises from a bedside and searches quietly for the next man who needs him. The night has not released the hospital. It has only thinned enough for morning to begin showing what remains. Morning does not arrive all at once in a Civil War field hospital. It collects gradually at the edges of things. First, the darkness outside the tent flap becomes less complete. The canvas overhead, black for most of the night, turns a dull grey. The lanterns still burn, but they no longer seem powerful. Their circles of yellow light begin to shrink against the steady pressure of day. Someone near the entrance notices it before anyone says a word. A nurse pauses with a cup in her hand and glances toward the opening. A stretcher-bearer coming in from the yard carries the faint colour of dawn on his coat. The horses outside look less like moving shadows and more like exhausted animals again, heads lowered, harness straps hanging damp against their sides. The night has not ended cleanly. It has simply become visible. For the men who have survived until this moment, morning is not cheerful. Not yet. It is proof. Proof that breath remained in them through the worst hours. Proof that the surgeon's decision, the nurse's attention, the opium, the bandage, the tourniquet, the ambulance ride, the thin margin of luck, all of it carried them across the night. Some realise this immediately. Others are too exhausted, too feverish, or too deeply sunk into pain to think of dawn in any deliberate way. They only notice that the room has changed. Faces are easier to see. The outline of rafters, tent seams, bedrolls, blankets, and blood-darkened cloth sharpen in the growing light. Men who spent the night hearing one another now begin, if they can turn their heads, to see one another properly for the first time. There is a line from Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's account of his own night in a field hospital after being grievously wounded near Petersburg that captures the hard simplicity of dawn better than almost anything else. At dawn, dear brave Prescott was dead, and I alive. He had been told he could not survive until morning. He had written a farewell to his wife. Surgeons had nearly given up, then tried once more and managed to help him. By the time light returned, the officer beside him had died, and Chamberlain had not. That is what morning meant in such a place. Not celebration, not rescue, complete. A dividing line. One man no longer breathing, another still present to notice it. Inside the hospital, the work changes with the light but does not slow. Surgeons who operated through the night do not simply walk away when morning appears. They revisit the most serious cases. Dressings are checked. Bleeding is watched. Those who underwent operations in darkness are examined more clearly now that daylight helps the eye. Men who arrive too late for treatment before dawn are reassessed. Wounds that seemed manageable in poor light may look worse in the morning. Others, feared to be catastrophic, may appear more hopeful once the swelling, the blood, and the confusion of the first examination are better understood. The hospital becomes, for a few hours, a place of second judgments. Nurses and attendants begin a new round of labour before the old one has finished. Those who spent the night moving from cot to cot do not receive a ceremonial pause at sunrise. Men need water again. Some need food, though many cannot take much. Others require medicines. Blankets that slipped during restless sleep must be adjusted. Bandages must be replaced or reinforced. A man who was too weak to speak before dawn now asks questions. What happened to my regiment? Where is my knapsack? Has anyone seen Lieutenant Miller? Did they take my leg? Can someone write to my mother? Morning produces questions because the mind, having endured the night, begins trying to rebuild the world around itself. The surgeons are tired enough that their movements become more deliberate, not because the urgency is gone, but because fatigue has settled into muscle and thought. In official reports and recollections, the medical officers of the Army of the Potomac are repeatedly described as working with relentless devotion after major engagements, often long after other parts of the army had begun resting or moving on. At Gettysburg, medical work continued across a landscape crowded with wounded in houses, churches, barns, and temporary stations. The battle ended on July 3rd, 1863, but for the wounded, the true aftermath began immediately and continued for weeks. It is worth being precise about one famous detail from Gettysburg, because it tells us both how far wartime medical organisation had come, and how much still remained. Jonathan Letterman later reported that early on the morning of July 4th, not one wounded Union soldier within the Army's lines had been left on the field unattended. This was a remarkable achievement after 3 days of enormous fighting, and it reflected the improved ambulance system he had helped build. But this did not mean the suffering had ended. It meant the wounded had been gathered in. They still lay in hospitals scattered across the area. They still needed operations, nursing, food, transport, and weeks or months of care. Being removed from the battlefield was not the same as being safe. It was the beginning of a different ordeal. Outside the hospital, daylight reveals what darkness had mercifully blurred. The road is carved by wheel ruts. Blankets and bits of torn uniform lie where they were dropped. The yard bears signs of repeated unloading. If the hospital stands near a farmhouse, the house no longer looks like a home. Doors have been propped open. Rooms are full of wounded men. The kitchen may have become a place where food and water are prepared for patients. The parlour may hold stretchers. The porch may support those not yet admitted or those being moved elsewhere. At Gettysburg, the wounded and dying crowded nearly every kind of structure available, while homes, churches, public buildings, fields, and gardens all became part of the emergency medical landscape. For civilians caught in the path of battle, mourning often confirmed that their ordinary lives had been swept aside. A schoolteacher named Sally Myers helped nurse wounded soldiers in her father's home and in a Catholic church in Gettysburg, later continuing her work at Camp Letterman. Others fed men, carried water, offered bedding, or helped tend the injured in whatever building had become a hospital without asking permission first. In some places the wounded remained for days or longer, and the people whose homes had been taken over by emergency care found themselves living inside the consequences of war, with no clear border between household and hospital. The men who survived the night begin to separate into different futures once morning comes. Some are stable enough to remain where they are while treatment continues. Some are too badly wounded to move far. Others, once examined and judged transportable, will be sent to larger general hospitals away from the battlefield. This transfer might happen soon, or it might take days, depending on the battle, the roads, the available ambulances, and the condition of the railroad. At Gettysburg, many wounded eventually passed through Camp Letterman, a large general field hospital east of town, before being transported to permanent hospitals in Philadelphia, Baltimore, or Washington. To a wounded soldier, the idea of leaving the field hospital might sound like relief. Sometimes it was. A permanent hospital offered more structure, more beds, more regular supplies, and a better chance at sustained recovery than a farmhouse floor or crowded canvas ward. But the journey there could be punishing. After Gettysburg, official medical accounts describe wounded men waiting for trains amid transportation delays, sometimes exposed to weather before proper arrangements were in place. When patients were finally moved, many travelled in boxcars or rail cars fitted as well as circumstances allowed, with straw or hay for bedding and medical attendants assigned to accompany them. The intention was humane. The experience could still be exhausting for men whose wounds had barely begun to settle. Picture one such soldier on the morning after battle. He has made it through surgery. His left arm is heavily bandaged. The pain is dulled but not gone. He has slept only in fragments. Now an attendant tells him he may be moved later if the surgeon approves. He imagines a train, but what he really imagines is distance. Distance from the operating tent. Distance from the road of ambulances. Distance from the sound of men arriving faster than they can. Be cared for. He does not know that the journey itself may hurt, that every jolt of a wagon toward the depot and every motion of the train will travel into his wound. For the moment, movement means possibility, and possibility is enough. Not all those who survived the night will recover. The hospital staff knows this even if no one says it openly near every cot. Morning can reveal a patient who appears steadier, but infection may come later. Gangrene, fever, and other complications remain deadly threats in Civil War medicine. The National Park Service notes that even after surviving an amputation, a soldier could still suffer infection afterward, and medical historians of the war repeatedly emphasize that surgery was only the first stage of survival. A man who opens his eyes at dawn has accomplished something real. He has not yet escaped danger. This is why the morning ward contains such uneven emotions. Relief in one corner, fear in another, grief where a blanket has been drawn over a face, practical determination near the dressing station, a nurse trying to coax a patient to drink, a steward calling for supplies, a clerk revising lists because some men have died, others have been identified, and still others have been transferred from the receiving area to a more permanent place in the hospital. Record-keeping was one of the important medical developments sharpened by the Civil War, and on the morning after battle that meant turning a night of confusion into names, locations, treatments, and outcomes as best the staff could manage. There may be letters begun at first light as well. A soldier who believed during the night that he might die now asks to write home with a slightly steadier hand, or asks someone else to write for him because his hand cannot manage it. Another wants to correct what he said in panic a few hours earlier. A third asks that his family be told he's alive before anything else. Nurses and aid workers frequently helped soldiers communicate with home, and in the aftermath of battles, those letters carried the first fragile proof that a man had survived long enough to speak for himself. A man near the doorway has spent the night listening rather than sleeping. By morning, he knows which cries stopped, which names were called repeatedly, which footsteps belong to the nurse who brings water, and which to the surgeon who rarely pauses. He has learned the hospital as if it were a strange temporary village. Now, with daylight on the canvas and the room in full view, he sees that the world he built from sound was accurate in some places and not in others. The patient he thought elderly is hardly older than himself. The nurse whose voice sounded calm looks worn nearly through. The surgeon whose commands seemed harsh has dark rings beneath his eyes and blood at his cuffs from hours of work. Mourning does not make the hospital gentler. It makes everyone in it more human. Outside, burial details begin or continue. The dead from the battlefield and the hospitals cannot be ignored once daylight returns. At Antietam, for example, the Miller farm and surrounding ground bore the mark of fighting and burials for days afterward. Wounded soldiers were moved to field hospitals, while burial parties worked in the devastated landscape. Gettysburg would likewise become a vast scene of graves, temporary cemeteries, and eventually the establishment of a national cemetery. The wounded who remain conscious may not witness all of this directly, but they understand that the mourning belongs not only to survivors, it belongs also to the dead who must be counted, moved, and mourned. The armies themselves may already be turning their attention elsewhere. This is another hard fact of wartime hospitals. The battle can move on while the wounded remain behind. After Gettysburg, the Union Army began moving away while medical personnel and relief workers stayed to care for thousands who could not travel. Official histories describe surgeons consolidating the worst cases and developing Camp Letterman as patients were gathered and evacuated northward. To the soldier lying under canvas, this may feel strange. Yesterday he belonged to a regiment in motion. Today he belongs to a hospital, whose world advances not by miles but by dressing changed, fevers monitored, and transport arranged. For some, mourning brings the first clear look at what their body has become. A man who lost a hand, a foot, or a leg under. Chloroform wakes more fully as the light strengthens. The blanket covers the wound. He may not look immediately. He may know already without looking. A nurse may tell him gently. A surgeon may return to explain. Or there may be no time for a careful conversation until later. The psychological shock of survival could be immense, especially for amputees who had entered battle in full physical strength the day before. Civil War medical care saved many lives through amputation, and a significant majority of amputees survived the procedure itself, but survival opened into a future that required adjustment, dependence, and rebuilding. Others wake to smaller mercies. Their limb was not removed. The ball missed bone. The bleeding has stopped. The surgeon believes the wound can heal if infection does not set in. Such men may feel almost guilty when they see the severity of injuries around them. Relief in a hospital is rarely pure. It arrives beside comparison. A soldier with a bandaged shoulder hears that the man who rode beside him in the ambulance died during the night. A private with a leg wound discovers that the officer across from him has lost his arm. A man who prayed simply to live until morning opens his eyes and realizes the prayer was answered in a room where many others received no such answer. There is food somewhere, though not enough of anything, and the smell of it begins to move through the hospital once morning work organises itself. Broth, coffee if available, bread, something soft for those who can swallow. At major wartime hospitals, relief organisations such as the Sanitary Commission help provide supplies and nourishment, and in battered towns like Gettysburg, civilians and aid workers became part of the effort to feed and sustain the wounded. After a night of blood loss, surgery and fear, the ordinary act of accepting a spoonful of warm food could feel almost unreal. The body that had been treated as a wound through the night is reminded that it is still a body needing breakfast. Someone asks what day it is. It is a simple question, but it carries weight. Battle distorts time. Surgery distorts time. Pain distorts time. Men who woke before dawn yesterday in a camp now lie under hospital canvas, trying to understand how an entire life changed in less than 24 hours. A nurse answers. Perhaps it is July 4th at Gettysburg. Perhaps September 18th after Antietam. Perhaps March 20th after Bentonville. The exact morning changes from battle to battle, but the experience repeats. A wounded man asks for the date because he needs to reconnect himself to the calendar. Ordinary people are still using somewhere beyond the hospital. The hospital continues filling even after dawn. Men found late on the field arrive belatedly. Those whose wounds were first treated elsewhere are transferred in. Wagons still move. The urgency shifts, but it does not vanish. At Bentonville in 1865, wounded men were moved onward in wagons after battle, and the official reports show how long the process of evacuation and care could extend beyond the moment of combat itself. The morning hospital is not merely cleaning up from the night. It is still receiving war into its care. If we stand once more just outside the hospital entrance, the whole scene looks different now from what it did in darkness. The tents are visible, the barn roof is visible, the path toward the road is visible, the people are visible. A nurse crosses the yard carrying folded cloth. 2 attendants move an empty stretcher back toward the receiving area. A surgeon steps outside only long enough to take a breath and then turns back in. A wagon pulls away, perhaps toward the station, perhaps toward another nearby hospital, perhaps back toward the field. Nearby, one soldier who can sit upright watches the morning with an expression difficult to name. He is alive, he is not whole, he is not safe from every danger. But he has reached the light, and I want you to think about that, because we often use the word survive as if it describes a single clean event. He survived the battle, he survived the operation, he survived the night. But for the men in these hospitals, survival came in pieces. 1 hour, then another. 1 dressing, then another. 1 wagon ride. 1 surgery. 1 cup of water. 1 morning breath. The future did not arrive all at once. It accumulated slowly around them, just as daylight accumulated across the canvas and floorboards. By full morning, the hospital is awake in a different way. There is no need now for lanterns near every task, though some still burn where interiors remain dim. The wounded who slept little stare toward openings in tents or windows in borrowed buildings. Nurses continue rounds. Surgeons continue consultations. Clerks continue writing. Beyond the hospital grounds, burial parties, supply wagons and military orders begin shaping the day. But inside, the central fact remains almost painfully simple. Some men did not reach this hour, some did. For those who did, morning is not an ending. It is the first clear look at what must be endured next. So when you imagine spending the night in an American Civil War field hospital, do not imagine only the surgeon's knife or the ambulance wheels or the groans from the dark. Imagine also this grey, exhausted morning, the light falling over men who thought they would never see it. The nurse setting down 1 more cup, the surgeon returning to 1 more bed, the clerk writing 1 more name carefully enough that someone far away might one day know where that soldier had been, the horse team starting again, the hospital, battered and crowded, moving forward because it must. and the men who survived the night lying still for a moment, listening to the ordinary sounds of morning gather outside, knowing that for now at least they are still among the living.